Okay, good afternoon and welcome. My name's Ross Little, and I'm here presenting this session with you this afternoon. I work as a senior lecturer in the Division for Community and Criminal Justice. So I focus on criminology and criminal justice, and I lead a module which focuses on young people and the criminal justice system. And one of the topics we talk about on that module and discuss is the minimum age of criminal responsibility. So that's what I'd like to discuss with you this afternoon as part of this DNU Festival of Teaching. And if the events team are able to just bring the slides up, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much. So hopefully people can hear me and see the slides now. We've got a chat function operating today, which means you can put in your comments and questions, and I'll get to those as I can. And there's also a couple of interactive elements as well, which means that I'm kind of encouraging you to engage with the presentation. And if you're able to, it would be great if you're able to interact with comments and questions as we go through. It does mean I think you have to sign into either your YouTube account or your Google account. So for those of you who are able to do that, I think through kind of PCs and laptop devices, then please do, because it means there'll be more interaction with you and a little bit less chat from me. One thing I should say is that this presentation started out with a blog piece which featured in The Conversation, which is an online, hosts online blog articles about a whole range of different subjects. And this was something that was published towards the end of 2018 with the title of "Congratulations, you're 10, now you can be arrested." And so if you wanted to access that after this, you'd be very welcome. And that blog piece itself was inspired by a conversation I had with my daughter. I've just got a slide here showing you the image they used for the blog, the conversation team. I thought found a really evocative image of the candles, which I thought was a nice depiction of that sense of celebration of reaching 10, but also the idea that we suddenly become eligible for arrest under the criminal law. So that blog piece is there online. You can access that through the conversation. And there's just my job title there, senior lecturer. And as I say, I work in the Division of Community and Criminal Justice here in the School of Applied Social Sciences. Oh yeah, actually, so if for those of you who have been able to sign in, I just wanted to ask you a quick question before we begin. So just to clarify what this minimum age of criminal responsibility is. And the minimum age of criminal responsibility, sometimes abbreviated in this presentation as MACR, is the lowest age at which someone can be arrested and charged with a criminal offence in our legal jurisdiction, so which is England and Wales. And I just wondered whether, just before we actually start the presentation, whether you think that 10 years of age is too low, whether it's too young, whether it's too high, or whether you think it's about right. If you don't know, just put don't know. It'll just be an early indication of who's able to kind of log in and interact. Thank you very much, Laura. Yes, just whether you think it's number one, whether 10 years of age is too low, too young. Number two, whether it's too high, whether it's too old. Or number three, whether it's about right. Thank you, Tim. colleague from over in the law department thinks it's too low. Thank you very much. Kieran is saying too low as well. Too low. Lily, I think someone that's been in one of my lectures. Thank you, Rob. So a few people, no one so far, thinking it's too high or about right. So we've got an audience of converts already. Anyone there that think it might be too high, or even about right? So far, nobody. Everyone thinks it's too low. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, so far everyone in on the presentation thinks it is too low, and we'll see perhaps what you think by the end, whether we've confirmed our views or whether we think it should be something different. So let's consider where this started really. Before I wrote this blog piece, congratulations, you're 10, now you can be arrested. I'd been thinking about this topic, particularly as I'm involved with a charity called the National Association for Youth Justice. But what crystallized it and made me sure I wanted to write something about it was a conversation I had with my daughter. At the time, she was 9, and she came up to my desk where I was working, and she noticed a book that was on the desk, and it was called Children Behind Bars, which is by Caroline Willow, who's the director of a charity called Article 39. She leads a campaign with others focusing on ending child imprisonment. So if you haven't already read it, I would recommend it. But my daughter came up to me and said, "Children behind bars, Daddy, what does that mean?" And I thought, well, I need to try and explain this to a 9-year-old girl. How do I explain it? I said, well, it means children in prison. Children who are in prison. Children who are in prison. And she couldn't get her head around this. And she was, well, how old are these children that are in prison? I said, well, most of them are 15 or 16, 17. Some even might be 18. But you could be arrested from the age of, and she found that really difficult to comprehend. She was like, "But I'm nearly 10." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." And that idea of this kind of 9-year-old girl being potentially eligible for arrest, there was that disconnect, which got me thinking that, yeah, I think this does need to be written about. And I wondered how many people were aware of this, because I think it's not something that's necessarily taught in school, and we don't seem to have that much public debate about it, which is why I thought it'd be something that's good to talk about as part of this Festival of Teaching. And so we have this minimum age of criminal responsibility of 10 years old. And we might ask ourselves, is it too low, too high, or about right? But how would we know? What do other legal jurisdictions do? And could it be time to reconsider that age of criminal responsibility here? And one way of exploring that and communicating that is with this an interactive game, kind of a card game almost, based on the higher or lower concept. Some people, if you're old enough, might remember a game show called Play Your Cards Right, and which was hosted by the late Bruce Forsyth. It's just one way to think about the minimum age of criminal responsibility as an international comparison. So let me start this up and invite you to guess or let me know if you already know what you think. We'll start out with one country, and we'll compare these with other countries as we go through, as I turn over the cards. Does anybody happen to know, or would you like to guess at what age the minimum age of criminal responsibility is in Argentina? Thank you. Yeah, feel free to put your guesses in the comment box. No cheating, no Googling this. And I'll go through and uncover other countries once you've guessed this. 16, says Kieran. God, you guys are on fire today. Jane's guessed 16 as well. It is, in fact, 16 years old. Yeah, Lily and Rob, they're guessing at 14, which is a good guess. As we see, that's a very common age of criminal responsibility across the world. Others also guessing at 14. It's actually 16 years old. Yeah, there's a prize on its way to Kieran and Jane, which would be an NAYJ publication, The State of Youth Justice. So then, what about Denmark? To some extent, I've picked these countries at random. There's a few European countries in here, a couple of African countries, South American country and Argentina. Is Denmark higher or lower than Argentina? Higher or lower? So is Denmark's age of criminal responsibility higher or lower than Argentina? Anyone like to guess? And we'll hopefully speed through these as we... events team are guessing higher. Let's have a look. It's actually 15. It's slightly lower. Yes, thank you, Tim. You're absolutely right. Oh, how about the Netherlands? Higher or lower than Denmark? Geographically, culturally, not that far. Yeah, lower still, says, yeah, and Kieran and Jane doing well on this. 12 years old, absolutely. Next one, France. Is France higher or lower than the Netherlands? Yeah, so lower. Let's have a look. Lily says lower than the Netherlands, 12 years old. It's in fact 13 years old. So children aged 13 to 18 can be criminally sentenced, including to prison. And children aged 16 to 18 can, in certain circumstances, be subjected to adult sentences as well. Yeah, Kieran and Jay are on fire here. If there's other people who'd like to engage too, feel free. So thank you for everyone who's engaging so far. So already seeing a bit of variation here. What about Burundi, going to the African continent? Anyone like to guess, is Burundi higher or lower than France? Events team, guessing lower. Let's have a look. It's 15. Events team. Oh, Kieran's doing well again. Higher. Thank you, Aaron. Karen, well done to Kieran and Aaron and Jane, all of which have guessed higher. Absolutely. I should say the source of this information while we're here is the Children's Rights International Network, who've got a really good interactive map on here. Also useful, a really useful guide on life imprisonment. It is, in fact, higher. Sorry, Lily, and events team. Excellent. A topic for your dissertation. Excellent. I'm glad to hear it. So then, perhaps you can tell me whether the minimum age of criminal responsibility for Senegal is higher or lower than Burundi. Higher or lower? Higher or lower for Senegal relative to Burundi? You agree with me? That's wise. That's wise, Rob. Kieran, can you tell us whether you think Senegal lower? Says Jane. Yep, 13, absolutely. Moving on to Turkey. So there are no provisions permitting criminal penalties for children under the age of 13 in Senegal. How about Turkey then? How about Turkey? Would we say higher or lower than Senegal? Perhaps a tricky one. 13, tricky kind of age. Difficult to know whether this might be higher or lower. Higher. Let's have a look. Same age. Says the events team. Okay. It's actually very slightly lower. Lily, yeah, tricky one. They are getting more difficult. I had a slightly easier version of this game for my lecture group, but they got them all right first time. So I decided it was a little bit too easy, and so I've mixed it up a little bit. Okay, after Turkey then. How about Germany? We think higher, yeah. Germany is higher or lower than Turkey? Just going to check in on the... Okay, it's maybe a little bit slower coming through. I'll put you out. Oh, yeah, higher. Let's go. 14 years old. Yeah, in fact, so no one who's younger than 14 at the time of alleged offence in Germany can be held criminally responsible. So children aged 14 to 18 can be criminally liable, where at the time of the offence they were mature enough to see the injustice of the act and to act upon this knowledge. So this idea of seeing the injustice of the act coming into play here. Okay, we're getting close to the end. How about Portugal then? The end of the game, I mean. Portugal, higher or lower than Germany? Hi. Oh, yeah, Kieran and Aaron know their stuff. You're absolutely right. Portugal, 16, so persons under the age of 16 cannot be held criminally liable. People aged between 12 and 16 can be subject to penalties under the guardianship and education law, which allows for the detention of children in closed, what they call educational centres. So it was actually higher there, Jane, than Germany. And then last but not least, and I think I've already mentioned this, England and Wales has a minimum age of criminal responsibility of 10. And as we look then across these different legal jurisdictions, we can see, yeah, absolutely. It's quite surprising, isn't it? We can see, first of all, that there are different ages. Also, that the variation is fairly wide. I haven't included the full range here. But that England and Wales is considerably lower than the rest of these legal jurisdictions. And indeed, it is an outlier, an international outlier, and has been described as such by in a paper that Tim Bateman wrote for the National Association for Youth Justice back in 2012. So thank you everyone for interacting with that. I'd see how many people were able to kind of log in to, via YouTube and Google. There will be another opportunity to interact in a few minutes' time. So please do stay logged in. As I say, that comes from the Child Rights International Network, really useful source of information. They've got some useful guides there, some international comparisons in terms of the law, the minimum age of criminal responsibility, and also the use of life imprisonment, as I say. So we can see that, to some extent, there is no right and wrong in this. The minimum age of criminal responsibility varies across these different legal jurisdictions. You may operate a legal jurisdiction with a different minimum age of criminal responsibility to other people. There do seem to be different interpretations, or there are different interpretations of this. In relation to that last slide, by the way, England and Wales, you might be wondering what it is elsewhere. United Kingdom, for example, Northern Ireland is the same as England and Wales with 10. And there have been recent discussions to increase that minimum age of criminal responsibility, but I don't believe that's been implemented yet. In recent years, Scotland has increased its minimum age of criminal responsibility to 12. There's a range across United Nations member states between 7 and 16. And in 2007, so about 15 years ago, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child declared an age of criminal responsibility of less than 12 years not to be internationally acceptable. So there's a kind of a set of norms that have developed, really, which means the United Nations has felt that for about 15 years or so, it's been able to say, look, to be honest, we don't think any legal jurisdiction should have an age of criminal responsibility that's lower than 12. And in fact, the most common age, according to the Child Rights International Network, is actually 14. And that's the age that's in place in around about a quarter of countries across the world. And the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales did some research, I think it was undertaken by Neil Hazel in 2008, showing that of 90 countries, the most common age was actually 14. So considerably higher than the age we've got here in England and Wales. So we are something of an international outlier. But how did we get to this position? Well, it's complicated, and it's to do with history and politics and the evolution of our society. Just over 100 years ago, in 1908, a separate juvenile court was created for children aged 7 and above. And custody was actually abolished at that time for under 14s. A few years later, in the early 1930s, the minimum age of criminal responsibility was raised to 8 in England and Wales. A generation later, in the 1960s, it was raised to 10 years of age, and that's the age that we have now. An age of 12 was actually recommended by the Ingleby Committee, which was thinking very much about the welfare needs of children, about the idea of early intervention in children's lives, and the need for extra family support in some circumstances. A series of scandals in the 1960s also kind of influenced thinking at the time. And by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, it was actually incorporated into legislation. The Children and Young Persons Act 1969 raised the age of criminal responsibility to 14. However, it was never implemented. A year later, there was a change of government, change of administration, and that was never implemented. So we can see this gradual increase of the minimum age of criminal responsibility and the thinking that surrounded it, and particularly kind of the welfare provisions that were introduced in the 1930s and through the 1960s. But then by the time we get to the 1990s, we see something of a reverse. So there's been a growing concern with the issue of crime and the growth in the recorded crime rate. Crime starts to be politicized towards the end of the 1970s and through the 1980s, when we've got a government that's much more interested in pursuing a law and order agenda. And then through the 1990s, growing concern, particularly with the idea of crime and antisocial behavior committed by children and young people. And particular concern in the early 1990s around the Bolger case. Thompson and Venables put on trial for the killing of a 2-year-old boy, James Bolger. This growing concern with crime and the idea that too many people were, and too many children were not being processed effectively by the system, led to the new Labour government saying, well, in fact, we need no more excuses. The police need to bring more people to justice, particularly younger people. And around the time they created the new youth justice system, the youth justice system that we've largely got to this day, almost 25 years later, they brought in some legislation in the form of the Crime Disorder Act in 1998, which abolished a legal doctrine, a legal assumption, really, that had been there for hundreds of years. This was called Doli Inca Pax, and this was the idea that children under the age of 14, so effectively between the age of 10 and 14, were incapable of evil. They were incapable of comprehending the criminal wrongfulness of their actions. That legal assumption, as I say, was abolished, and that meant that that it went from the burden of proof being on the prosecution. That burden of proof effectively switched to the defense. And so it was no longer the job of the prosecution to show that a child of 10 or 11 or 12, say, was able to comprehend the criminal wrongfulness of their actions. This was now effectively assumed to be the case. Effectively, all children from 10 years were then, after 1998, considered to be unequivocally responsible and accountable for the choices made and the harm caused, and then subject to criminal punishment accordingly. Fast forward to 2016, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child said that the age of 10 in England and Wales was too young. It needs to be raised in accordance with acceptable international standards. So it's a potted kind of brief history related to where we are now. And we can see that this has changed over time. There's no one fixed position. It was increased in the 1930s. It was increased in the 1960s. It would have been increased further. But as I say, there was a change of government. Then there started to be a change of public mood and change of government priorities as well. And we can see that the last change effectively was in the late 1990s. And I suppose my question now is partly whether it's time to reconsider that and whether we need to update our thinking. At the heart of this, or one way of looking at this, is to consider the extent to which children know right from wrong. About 10 years ago or so, the Minister with responsibility for youth justice, which was Crispin Blunt, told Parliament that children aged 10 are able to distinguish between bad behaviour and serious wrongdoing. It is entirely appropriate, therefore, to hold them to account for their actions if they commit an offence, and it is important to ensure that communities know that a young person who offends will be dealt with appropriately. Thus, we have no plans to change the age of criminal responsibility. So, children, according to the government, are able to distinguish between bad behaviour and serious wrongdoing at the age of 10. A little further on in 2017, the UK government stated that setting an age of criminal responsibility at the age of 10 provides some flexibility for the system and allows for early intervention to prevent further offending. And they iterated this idea that 10-year-olds can distinguish between bad behaviour and serious wrongdoing. But is that really the case? Can all 10-year-olds distinguish between bad behaviour and serious wrongdoing? And how would we know? And perhaps more pertinently, is it clear that children of this age commonly fully understand the legal consequences that flow from their actions? You might detect it, I'm somewhat sceptical that they can. Or at least there may well be some differences, some quite considerable differences between children. Neuroscientific evidence in the past 15 years or so, and neuroscientific research has provided strong evidence that the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain which controls executive functions such as organisation, problem solving, planning and decision making, fully develops much later than previously thought, perhaps closer to the age of 25. In addition, children exposed to the criminal justice system have been found more likely to experience learning difficulties and adverse childhood experiences, which impacts on that development. As David Pryor and his research colleagues have pointed out, there is strong evidence that from a neurological perspective, the human brain is not fully developed in its capacity for cognitive functioning and emotional regulation until well into the period of young adulthood. And in fact, since then, further neuroscientific research has shown there's this disconnect between parts of our brain that are responsible for responding to emotions. The stage in our life that develops is somewhat earlier than the parts of the brain that develop in a way that can regulate that emotion. So for a period of time in adolescence, and this will vary between individuals, we're rather better at responding to our emotions. Our brain is rather better at processing those than we are the mechanisms that control those emotions. So we see a lot of kind of opportunistic and creative, spontaneous behavior in adolescence, which can be highly valued and highly valuable, but otherwise can also be seen as quite spontaneous, impetuous, and potentially quite risky in some circumstances as well. And all of this type of thinking is characterized by the stage of adolescence, that stage between childhood and adulthood. What some people refer to as the transition to adulthood. As I say, the Children and Young Persons Act legislated to prohibit the prosecution of any child below the age of 14, following the advice from the Ingleby Committee some years earlier. There was also a strong presumption against the prosecution of children aged 14 to 16. But one of the practical consequences of ignoring all of that and then moving in the opposite direction in the 1990s, that actually children even younger than the age of 10 end up finding themselves within the criminal justice system. The APPG, which stands for the All-Party Parliamentary Group, so a parliamentary subgroup effectively, that inquiry, which reported in 2014 on children and the police, found that over 1,000 children under the age of 10, and some as young as 4, had been stopped and searched by the police in England and Wales over the previous 5 years. These are just the ones we've got recorded. So one of the practical consequences of having a minimum age of criminal responsibility of 10 is that you bring much younger children into the sphere of criminal justice response, partly because police won't always be able to distinguish between, for example, a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. I mean, although I have to say it's quite hard to justify or explain how a 4-year-old gets caught up in that, but nonetheless. But the point being that when you do have this young age of such a young minimum age of criminal responsibility, you will bring even younger children into that criminal justice and net. I can just see we've got a comment there as well from Aaron, who's himself produced an excellent report from UNICEF talking about the political context. Thank you very much. Oh, thanks for putting that up there. Recently saw the following encouraging article from Baroness Bennett from the Green Party, where she, you're absolutely right, calls for raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility. Thanks so much for that, Aaron. That's a really good point. And encouraging to see, and there's been, I mean, this has been raised in the Lords as well, hasn't it, repeatedly in recent years by Lord Dalacchia. So there has been some attention in political circles, and there has been some attention in Parliament, but it hasn't yet captured much of the policy focus of the mainstream political parties, I think because they haven't really seen many votes in it. And so yeah, that's really encouraging that that's the case. Thank you, Aaron. So yeah, if people would like to Google that, it might be useful for people's assignments and dissertations that are coming up. If there's any, I know there's 1 or 2 students here from my module group. So we've thought about the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales relative to other legal jurisdictions, and its appropriateness, and the fact that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have said, you know, no country really should have a minimum age of criminal responsibility that's less than 12. The average, if you like, across the world is more like 14. So that's one way of thinking about the rightness or the appropriateness of our own minimum age of criminal responsibility. Another way of thinking about it is, well, at what age are we able to do other things that require a level of autonomous decision making, a level of individual responsibility, and when does our society allow us to do those things? And we might think of those as civil rights or entitlements. And so I've got a number here, a list of these, and invite us to consider the age at which we can do certain things in our lives as part of that transition to adulthood. So if anyone's still logged in, would you like to let us know or guess when you're able to open a bank account? At what age are we able to open a bank account? 18. That's a good guess, Kieran. It's actually, let me just click on that. It's actually 16. Yes, 16. Well done, Rob. Events team. Well, you can actually open an account age 12, but I think that's with parental advice and parental signature and parental control, effectively. So yeah, some good guesses in there. So do have to be 13. So I know because I opened an account for my daughter when she was 13, and that's when you get access to a card, I think, as well, with a certain spend amount on it, depending on which bank you go with, I think. What about the age at which you can ride a motorbike? And here we're talking about a 50cc motorbike. Any guesses? Or do we know? Jane's saying she didn't realise there was a minimum age for this. Yeah, yeah. A good guess. Yes, it is. DMU events team going in for 16. Well done. 18. It is. It's a little bit younger. Yeah, you're right. It's 16. Lily's saying 17. Tim 17. It's actually 16. You can ride a motorbike at a 50cc. What about consent to sexual activity? And I don't know whether that latest response from Jane there is in relation to riding a motorbike or consenting to sex. If it was the latter, yeah, Kieran and Jane, if it's the latter, you're absolutely right. It's 16 years of age. What about, and we're on to driving a car now. Yeah. So Kieran, you're absolutely right to say 16 for consenting to sex, and anyone else that said 16 was absolutely right. Kieran's right again. Driving a car is 17. I think there are some kind of exceptions to that. So you can drive a car when you're 16 if you get or you've applied for the enhanced rate of the mobility component of the personal independence payment. So there are some circumstances you can drive a car when you're 16, but otherwise you're absolutely right, it's 17. Kieran's saying it's quite logical that these are higher than the age of criminal responsibility. Yeah, which is kind of the point we're sort of getting to. Hopefully it's not too laboured, but yeah. What about buying a pet? What about buying a pet? Anyone like to guess at what age you can buy a pet in this country? In a way, I thought this was perhaps the most difficult one to guess, particularly before doing this subject. I didn't actually know there was. It kind of makes sense that there is. So Kieran says 15. Good guess. 16. Well done. You've pulled it back, DMU events team. Well done, Laura. 16 it is. What about then? Does it depend on the type of pet? It's a good question. There probably are some legal restrictions around the type of pet, but you can't even buy any pet, I believe, until the age of 16. Yeah, it is 16. Yeah, nice one, Jane. Thank you very much. And thanks for everyone interacting so far. What about getting married? It's a slight delay on the connection, I think. But hopefully that's coming through. Anyone like to guess? Yeah. So Kieran's saying it's 18, but 16 with parental consent. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So you're right there, Chandrima. Yeah. Could be 17 with parental consent. Yeah. So it's 18 years of age, but you can get parental consent at age 16 or 17. There's no law against religious or cultural ceremonies which are not registered with local councils taking place under that age, but generally it's 18, as you say. Playing the lottery or gambling, I'll fill that one in, is actually 18. What about getting a tattoo? Anyone like to guess about getting the age at which we can get a tattoo? Yeah, Kieran, you're absolutely right. Getting a tattoo is age 18. And a fun fact, which I discovered when I was doing this research, is that I don't think any other European country has the same kind of prohibition on under 18s. So no, it's not 12. You might think it's younger, but yeah, it's actually 18 in this country, so relatively high. A topical one here. What about serving in the military? Serving in the military. What age can you serve in the military? '16, it's a good guess. You can actually enlist in the armed services at age 16, but I don't think you can fight on the front line until the age of 18. So I think you can enlist with parental consent age 16, but you won't fight on the front line till 18. I think in European countries, other European countries, it tends to be 18. So interestingly, we're quite old when it comes to tattoos, young in relation to the military. You can decide whether you think we've got the right way wrong or not, right way round or not. You can vote in parliamentary elections at age 18, buy tobacco at age 18 as well. And that changed in 2007. So many of us will be able to remember a time that we could buy tobacco when we were 16. And some people used to get their friends to go in the shop, who looked older, looked 16, to buy cigarettes and the like. You can buy adult fireworks, so-called adult fireworks, from 18. Last one, actually, is about the age at which you can sit on a jury. Does anyone know about the age you can sit on a jury? While you're just pondering that one, Tim's got a comment here. Thank you very much, Tim, who points out that international criminal law considers anyone under the age of 18 to be a child, and therefore child soldiers are seen as victims rather than perpetrators. That's a really good point when we're thinking about exploitation and vulnerability and victimization as well. Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's a relevant comment. Useful to have expertise in the virtual room from someone from the law department here. Always good to have legal expertise. It's when you're compiling this as well, you realize the legal nuance involved in some of these ages. across different legal jurisdictions. 18 is indeed right, yeah. Yeah, and in fact, Jane, who's here as well, got strong record on international humanitarian work. Yes, you can be you can be convicted of violations over the age of 15, she's proposing. Under international humanitarian law. So yeah, you're absolutely right. When you guessed at 18, you cannot sit on a jury until the age of 18. But you can be arrested by the police for a criminal offence from the age of 10. So we see that we're not just an international outlier. There's also a disconnect here between these other civil rights and entitlements. And so in summary then, as I say, we're not just an international outlier, but we are quite unusual. We have a very low age of minimum age of criminal responsibility across these international legal jurisdictions that I've picked out. I just picked out about 10 or so there, but it's consistent across the wider piece. In practice, we've seen that under 10s do become arrested when you have a system that allows the arrest of 10-year-olds. It's inconsistent with these civil rights. And we noted within that a particular couple of inconsistencies. For example, that you can be arrested at age 10, but that you're unable to sit on a jury which decides the guilt or innocence of another citizen until the age of 18. You can be treated as a sex offender effectively from age of 10, and there are children on the sex offenders register, but you're unable to consent to sexual activity until the age of 16. And so those points, and potentially others too, and others besides, mean, or really they crystallize the question, and they might make us wonder whether it's in fact time to reconsider the age of criminal responsibility. So absolutely, as the events team, and thank you to Laura for coordinating this today. There is a time for any questions or comments, particularly about whether you think it is time for us to consider. We've seen that there were changes proposed to minimum age of criminal responsibility in the 1930s, the 1960s. We then took something of a backward step in the 1990s. My argument would be that it is time to reconsider and have a more public debate about the minimum age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales. Yes, so Kieran's asking, what is my opinion? Should the age be changed? It's a good question. I definitely would be interested in the views of other people, which is why I wanted to bring this into a more public forum. I think to some extent, any age we choose is arbitrary. It does depend on the other kind of provisions that we have around the minimum age of criminal responsibility, so particularly in relation to our welfare system. But I do think there's a good case to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility. In relation to these international norms, you could say 12 or 14. I'd argue, and this would be the position of, for example, the National Association for Youth Justice, there's a good case to increase it to 16. And some people might say, well, this means that we would be ignoring offending behaviour by children. And I don't think that necessarily has to be the case at all. In fact, we already have children that can be detained under welfare provisions in legislation. And in fact, people quite often cite the Bolger case as a reason why we should not raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility. But I don't think that's a particularly strong argument. For example, those children, Venables and Thompson, were held in secure children's homes for a number of years before they were moved into the adult prison estate. And in that respect, they may well have been detained under welfare legislation instead. Also, other countries have dealt with rather similar cases quite differently, and there's a case from Norway. Rob Canton, Professor Rob Canton, has written a useful book called Why Punish, asks, might there be other and better ways of responding to wrongdoing that avoid the harshness of criminalisation and its lasting stigma? In the short answer to that, I think, is yes. I think responding to criminal behaviour, it's quite an emotive topic, and I think people can get quite emotionally engaged, and that's what a lot of the headlines around the Bolger case were designed to do, is to get us kind of get this emotionally condemnatory behaviour about how shocking and awful this case was. But actually, appealing to our emotions is perhaps not always the best way of proceeding here. And when we think about some of the harms that are caused by the criminal justice system, and particularly imprisonment for children, and then the stigma associated with a criminal record, which does effectively, hinder children move on from that, it doesn't actually serve those individual children very well, but it also doesn't serve us as a society very well. So I do think, yes, there is scope for rethinking the whole criminal justice system and the response, particularly for children who break the criminal law. Tim saying, in recent years, the number of under 18-year-olds has declined, whilst care proceedings have increased. Yeah. Have we seen a de facto raising of the age of criminal responsibility? It's an interesting one, isn't it? And in fact, we've got very few children under the age of 14 in prison at the moment. And so you might say that we have effectively raised the minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14 in practice. I think one of the issues of doing it in practice and not in principle is that that's quite open to reverse. And so we may well have done, but I think it does need legislative underpinnings to make sure that's more broadly understood. But I do think there are questions about other institutions and other processes as well, about what's done in the name of welfare. And also under mental health legislation as well. Here we've focused mainly on criminal justice. But yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. I've wondered that myself. But I do think that, so we've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of children going into prison over the past 13, 15 years. But I think that's been for potentially more practical reasons rather than principled ones. And as I say, it would be wise to give this a legislative recognition and underpinning. And you'd know at least as much as I do about that. Kieran's saying there's the argument rehabilitation against punishment. Our justice system tries to help young children, and perhaps it should not change. Yeah, this idea of rehabilitation, I think there's a question about what rehabilitation even means, actually. What does it mean to be rehabilitated, particularly for some of the most disadvantaged children who end up in our criminal justice system, and what resettlement following a period of imprisonment or being engaged in the criminal justice system means. My inclination is to think that because of the what we know from international settings, other legal jurisdictions, and what we know about other civil rights and entitlements, I think now would be a good time to increase that. And as Rob insinuates as well, perhaps the criminal justice system is not a good way of responding to that behaviour. Thanks, Tim. Absolutely, as Aaron points out, international children's rights implications of practical implementation too, and the standards associated with them. Absolutely, I think, as I say, to some extent, increasing the age in and of itself is relatively arbitrary, but I do think it would be importantly symbolic. it would mean that the law is kind of catching up with practice. It would perhaps help stop some of the potential reverses that might happen in the following years. And it would give a strong indication about how we as a society think it's most appropriate to respond to criminal law breaking by children. I'm conscious of time at the moment. I've just realised that according to my clock, it's just literally gone 2:00. Tim's just got a comment there as well about the big growth and deprivation of liberty orders amongst under 18-year-olds, which is worth investigating as well. I've included a slide here. I don't know if we can just pop back quickly here, just about further information, some sources of information I've used to compile this set of slides, a timeline, useful youth justice timeline from the Beyond Youth Custody project by Neil Hazel, Tim Bateman and Pippa Goodfellow, for example, who were involved in that work. It was funded by the Big Lottery, Child Rights International Network, the National Association for Youth Justice. And also, if you're interested in knowing more about imprisonment and were interested in a documentary, the Panorama programme from 2016 on teenage prison abuse exposed, focusing on Medway Secure Training Centre, is really helpful. If you're interested in contacting me about anything that's contained in this presentation, you're right to ask questions and add comments and pick me up on anything you need clarifying or you might think needs correcting. Feel free to contact me on that email address. Final slide is just a mention of something I think is important in the context of the youth justice system, which is a legal helpline, a free legal helpline that's run by the Howard League for Penal Reform for under 21-year-olds who find themselves in conflict with the law, and that is also free for under 21-year-olds who find themselves in prison. Really useful resource for helping facilitate the access to legal advice. And because, as we know, access to legal advice can be so tricky, and that's something that playing field really does need to be leveled up. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tim. That's very kind of you to say so. Thank you to everyone that's helped with the putting on the session, not least Laura in the events team, Stuart from the IT team, and thank you so much for all the interactions. It's helped break it up a bit, and so you're not just hearing my voice constantly. And thank you to everyone that's joined the session, even if you weren't able to interact. And can I recommend the other sessions as part of the DMU Festival of Teaching this week? There's some other fascinating presentations. I think that's it from me for now. So thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to see you another time.